So, hello and welcome. We are all at the Valdai Discussion Club conference. And it is the 20th anniversary conference, and I am joined here by three other people. There is Oleg Barabanov. Oleg Barabanov is the program director at the Valdai Discussion Club, and he has been that since 2015. And he is also a professor at the prestigious GIMO University, which is the university that trains Russian diplomats. So welcome, Oleg.
Thank you.
We're also joined here by Richard Sakwa. Richard is a professor emeritus of political science at the University of Kent, and he's a very well-known authority on Russia. Some of his most recent books, in fact, his most recent book, a very important one, is called The Lost Peace: How the West Failed to Prevent a Second World War. He's also the author. Sorry,
hopefully
Second Cold War. Sorry, thank you. The Second Cold War.
It's not as bad as that.
Deception, Russiagate and the New Cold War, and the Putin paradox. And Richard has been coming to Valdai Club conferences for a very long time. And we also joined by Glenn Diesen. Glenn is also a political scientist. He is a political scientist at Norway's Southeastern University, and he is also an extremely prolific writer. His most recent book, published just this year, is called The Ukraine War and the Eurasian Order. He's also a writer of another book, Russophobia, Propaganda in International Politics. Another one on Russian conservatism, and one which is entitled, very interestingly, Europe and as the Western Peninsula of Greater Eurasia. So welcome, Glenn.
Oh, thank you very much.
So here we are all at the Valdai Club conference. The Valdai Club is kind of like a Council on Foreign Relations or something like that of Russia. It meets annually every year. Roughly in the fall at this time. It used to be, it was created in 2004, and it used to be that Valdai Club conferences tended to be dominated by Western political scientists who would, and they would be here in very large numbers. Whereas, of course, in recent years, the character of Valdai has changed a great deal, as has Russia's foreign policy, moving away from a focus on the West and from Europe in particular, and towards a focus on Eurasia. This, as I said, is the 20th anniversary conference and the 21st conference, and the theme of the conference is lasting peace on what basis? This is the program of the conference. Lasting peace on what basis? Common security and equal opportunities for development. So it kind of shows you what kind of foreign policy Russia is pursuing. And the annual report, which was featured at this conference, is entitled "The World from Bottom Up," or the masterpieces of Eurasian architecture, which really tries to provide a roadmap, really, for Russia's foreign policy in the coming years and decades, and so on. And the other thing I should say in introducing this discussion is that the Valdai Club conference has always had the good fortune of being addressed at the end by a major speech by President Putin, and it has just been confirmed that this year also he will be here on the last day of the conference, which is Thursday. We are recording this on Tuesday evening. So maybe we should I'd just like to start off this discussion by asking Oleg Barabanov to start us off by saying a little bit about Valdai, what it is, what it aims to do, particularly the importance of this year's conference and the report of which he's the co-author. So Oleg, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, Radhika. In fact, Valdai is one of, I would say, major Russian think tanks who deals with international politics. Yes, we have the 20th anniversary now, but the idea at 2004 was to to meet many American specialists on Soviet and Russian affairs, to arrange a kind of sincere discussions, Chatham House rule discussions, closed discussions, to understand each other better and to explain them the Russian positions and to hear their positions. So it was started mainly as the Russian-American venue. And then step by step, year by year, we enlarged the audience. So we name ourselves a club, or the club, but we have no fixed membership. There are no member cards and membership fees. So it's a kind of rotation. Sure, that we have a kind of group that participate from year to year, but at every conference there are some new people with fresh ideas, and it's also important. Yes, we have the big annual conference each year. For the last, I think, 11 years, it's organized in the mountains near Sochi, in one of the Olympic venue of the Sochi Olympics 2014. And also we have several other research projects. We have annual conferences on Middle East, for example. We started to organize annual conferences on Africa, Russia-China meeting, Russia, Central Asia, and so on. We also, our website is quite active. We publish almost every day some expert comments. Almost every week we organize some smaller discussions at our headquarters in Moscow. So it's all bilingual in the Valdai practice. So the English-speaking audience, the audience of your stream, Radhika, could see our English website, valdaiclub.com, and to see all our publications, maybe to join the Zoom links or another links to participate at our conferences and discussions. So everybody is welcome. And also we prepare every year a group of our program directors. There are 6 research programs in the Valdai. I'm responsible for program. The name is changing. It's a bit volatile from year to year, but it's focused on values, ideologies, moral norms, something like this, how the West see it, how the East see it, how Russia sees it, and so on. And the current report is dedicated mainly to the new proposals, how to build the new Eurasian political infrastructure. We discuss the notions of trust, the notions of force, whether Eurasia needs some copying of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or no, something like this. And I think it would be interesting for the audience just to understand the Russian way of thinking. It's not, let's say, a kind of simple propaganda. Sure, every Russian text is propaganda for the Western mainstream, and every Russian expert is a Kremlin agent. I understand it quite well. But what we tried to write a normal text, ready to discuss it and ready to be criticized. That's more or less what is Valdai.
That's great. Do you want to go next, Glenn? How do you find this meeting?
Sure. No, I find it very interesting. Again, as well, you summarized when you mentioned a few of our books. My main interest is this Russian pivot to the east and the Eurasian format, because as we know, with through Russian history, we often had this rivalry between the British maritime power versus Russian, and America versus Russia, but it was always more or less a rivalry over hegemony. But the new Eurasia emerging now is very, very different. It's Eurasia of multipolarity. So it's one in which the major powers are, well, no one can really dominate, but many have different formats for Eurasia, and everyone has the commonality that in order to advance Eurasian integration, they have to seek to harmonize their interests with others. And I really think that the Chinese-Russian partnership has exemplified this because when you follow the Western academics or journalists, you often, for the past decades, they've been predicting that the Russians and the Chinese would clash in Central Asia. Instead, you see them accommodating each other, and it kind of set also the format for the rest of the region. So you see now, be it the SCO or BRICS, you have all these institutions to use economic connectivity to overcome these different political differences. So you see an opportunity for the Chinese and the Indians to get closer, for the Arabs and the Iranians. So it's a very different system than the usual bloc politics, the zero-sum alliance system, which often is in the pursuit of dominance. And hegemony. So it's a very very interesting place to be, as Barabanov pointed out. They bring in people from these different parts. So you have some, either academics or former political leaders or military leaders, and they kind of can try to piece it together. What is the challenges and interest of India, Pakistan, Russia, China, and then essentially trying to make this see to what extent these pieces fit together, and just becoming more familiar with these different perspectives. Again, it's a vast, huge continent, and even beyond Eurasia, we also, of course, there's a lot of representatives from Africa, Latin America. So, as a Western European or Scandinavian, it would be great. I would like to see Europe being a part of Eurasia, but obviously with the tensions these days, there's I guess more pressure on the Western academics not to come. But I would advise differently because it's immensely interesting.
Yeah, indeed. And it just occurs to me, I want to go to Richard immediately, but it occurs to me that maybe Oleg, you can also give us, before we go on to get into the discussion, give us an idea of the sorts of people who come here, and particularly who is here this year, and how that's different. How many people are here from how many countries and so on.
Well, it's about, I think, 130 people of about 50 countries, as it was announced. And you can see they are from different parts of the world. Experts from China, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, Vietnam, Japan. Maybe Japan is the only politically Western country that decided not to break all the academic relations with Russia, and the Japanese participants are often participate in our conferences. Also, several countries of Africa, South Africa, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Egypt, Algeria, also Brazil. So we are trying to put together all the BRICS experts. It's also politically important for us. And the experts from Central Asian states, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Armenia, some people from Middle East. It was interesting that you also have seen it today, that at our session on Middle East participated both the Arabs and the Israelis. Maybe it's one of the few places in the world now where the Arabs and the Israelis are ready to talk to each other. And so Valdai provides that opportunity. And also thank you for all of you, the Western experts who remained interested in Russian politics and Russian affairs. We understand that the situation is very difficult now politically, and maybe will be so for many years. But in difficult times, what is more important important is to listen to each other, to understand each other, and to criticize each other. It's exactly, I repeat, a very good for me example of the Japanese experts. They don't pose now, at least now, the friends of Russia. They are loyal to their official line of the Japanese foreign policy, absolutely. But they consider it important. And I think the Japanese government also considers it important that the expert of their country at least could know the Russian way of thinking and so on. And I'm glad to see that we have already the third annual conferences after 2022. And I see more Western faces. There are participants from Italy, from Greece, from other Western countries, from Hungary, let's say, Estonia, and it's a good sign. So it's not.
And you have here, and you have here people from Norway and the UK and Canada.
Yes, yes. Yes, what is important, sure that everybody in the Western mainstream don't trust me, but we don't want to organize a club of friends of Putin. Or there were the kind of new word neologism, Russia understanders or Putin understanders. It was invented just before the start of the
Absolutely. And the dialogue, as you say, the Middle East dialogue was absolutely so powerful. And of course, the Chinese, one of the Chinese intellectuals who was here was very critical of Russia. And he said, you've got to do ceasefire now, absolutely, in Ukraine and so on. So different views are voiced, absolutely. And I just wanted to say that, you know, there are people from all over the world and also from Western countries, as you just rightly pointed out. So having done that, oh, and I should also say one other thing, which is that I particularly was noting one participant in, I think it was the opening session that we had on the report that you had written, which I mentioned earlier. And various people pointed out that there was more dialogue between the two sides during the height of the Cold War than it seems there is today. So venues like Valdai are very important because this kind of contact, this kind of promotion of people-to-people contact, academic contact, intellectual contact is absolutely critical, particularly in bad times as we are in right now. So having said that, I'll pass the mic to you, Richard. Please go ahead.
Thanks so much. A few things. I'll just say a few words about the Valdai Club to begin with. In the Russian version, it's called the Valdai Diskussionny Club, the discussion club, and that it's in the name, and the name does, we do what we say in the name. Because right from the beginning, I've been coming since 2004, the first session, and in all those years, it's been fascinating that on only one occasion, on 21 sessions, was there a tone which was divisive or condemnatory, so down with the USA sort of talk. And immediately, when this person spoke in that sort of tone, which ran against the unwritten norms of these sessions, he was immediately said, no, we don't do that in the Valdai Club, and that was stopped. So it really is a platform for dialogue. And indeed, in the development now of a second Cold War, it is one of the few major platforms in which people from across the world come to Russia to discuss matters, not just about Russia, but about international politics, and indeed developments in the international system. And interestingly enough, we could write the history of the last 2 decades through the history of the Valdai Club, including, as we've noted, the changing composition. I mean, right from the start, yes, there were a lot from the United States, but there were also plenty of Europeans and always a Chinese and Indian presence. So it was always a genuinely international cohort. One thing which has changed a little bit is that in the early years, there was a far more significant presence of journalists as part of the delegate as it were. There's plenty of journalists here today, but they are, in their role as journalists rather than as participants. And I actually think that's rather healthy. In the early days, 5 journalists would ask exactly the same question, because when they filed their report, they could say, as I asked Mr. Putin or the minister or whatever. So it's much better. And indeed, I think that the general consensus is that the intellectual level now and the quality of debate has, it was always good, but it's now, I think, more focused, more wide-ranging, and as always, quite open to different viewpoints. And there's so many things one could say here, because this is an extraordinarily concentrated intellectual feast. You'd have to spend months gathering these people if you try to do it on your own. For example, today we had a fascinating discussion about this notion of a world majority. And within that panel, it was quite clear there were very sharp differences of views. And one of the key things which emerged and impressed me was the notion that this notion of a global south, no one liked it because it lumps people together who are very, very different countries. Malaysia, Egypt, South Africa, so many other countries. And the idea that this sort of an aggregate they can just be lumped away. And it is a way of, if you like, bracketing that. The whole vast community, which is non-Western, is just bracketed, or non-Northern even. And so, it's not quite clear. This notion of a world majority is a much more positive way of putting it, because it is the majority, and as they said. But even in that discussion, it was the angle, or with the strategy. Everyone was agreed that and I think now to go on to larger questions, that the development of this club reflects the larger development that the international system has matured since the Second World War. We've had decolonization. We now have 193 states in the United Nations, and it's come through. Almost every speaker has been arguing, non-Western one, to say that we now have an international community of sovereign states whose statehood and nationhood has matured, and they're now ready to participate in international politics as equals, and none of that sort of, if you like, the post-colonial cringe looking up to the previous colonizer. We are sort of in a post-colonial. The word which is usually used for that is decolonial, where it's not just hybridity, but it's actually a genuine move away to a new phase entirely. And that's quite clearly reflected in the sort of debates we've been having over the last few days. And so that's one thing. And of course, we had a very interesting session yesterday in which I participated on the notion of civilization. And it's obviously a great topic, but it tries to tie the international politics with the issues of tradition and culture and the interrelationship between a political system and a society more broadly. And of course, that immediately ensures a long historical context in China and India, both stress of 5,000 years. And of course, it makes the West look like a Johnny-come-lately who's just arrived, swaggering and barging in to a society which has existed, an international society, as English school people would say, for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So this longer historical perspective is something which was always there, but now far more accentuated, because we're moving towards, and this is my final point at this point, is just to say we're moving to a post-Western world. Very few people, in fact none I've heard, apart from one or two, and I just say, I don't want to give names and give them there. I just want to say, for example, the Egyptian delegation, there were quite a few Egyptian people, really did not like any tone. They were absolutely strong on their own sovereignty, independence, autonomy, and so on, but they were not keen on any anti-West bashing and that language. And so it's quite clear that the ethos is post-Western. That doesn't mean to say, and it's not anti-Western, it's anti-hegemonic, but not counter-hegemonic. Because if it was simply, as Glenn has just referred to that, because if it was counter-hegemonic, it would be doing the same thing, simply from the other side. And the point is of the Valdai discussions is that it tries to go beyond that to what would be a more positive agenda for peace and development, quite simply. So
I think that is, to me, what's the most exciting thing about being at Valdai over the last many years in particular. But, my first Valdai was actually only in 2015. So I was already, in a sense, part of, one already had a sense by that time that one was part of that what we were discussing here was a changing world order. And that, of course, that feeling has accelerated over the last many meetings, the post-COVID meetings, the meetings from 2022 onwards that we've had here. And so there are at least two major things going on. Obviously, on the one hand, there is a decline of Western power, the inability of the West to keep control over world developments. And that has its own dynamic, which we can discuss. But then there is also this other element of the construction of a new world order. And that has been, to me, an altogether very hopeful project, because everyone has emphasized several things. Number one, as you rightly say, it's not counter-hegemonic, it's not anti-Western, it is just non-Western. What the new world order, which is being talked about, which is a world order of greater equality, focusing on development, focusing on cooperation, recognition, and respect for sovereignty, and all these things. So, in a certain sense, is how do you construct this new world order, beginning with the Eurasian part, which is the focus of particularly this conference. And there, all that is required from the West is essentially that the West stops being hegemonic, stops being dominating, and accepts that it is one part, indeed, probably still the most prosperous part of a new world order, which is going to take a very different form and a very different architecture, isn't it?
Just coming out, it's a big all, if that's all that's required of the West, but it's a very big all. And that is the big challenge. Can the West normalize itself and become, United States and all the other countries simply become a normal part of a new type of political community, post-colonial, etc.?
Well, I suppose, I think that's also really interesting. I want to let Oleg and Glenn in as well, but I just quickly on that point, I've said for the last so many, in fact, a decade or more, that essentially it seems that the problem at the present moment is that the West does not have a plan B. Here we are recording this on the 5th of November as as citizens of the United States are going and voting for a new government. By tomorrow, hopefully, there will be a new government. However, it seems as though no matter who is elected, in the immediate, there's not going to be much difference. It looks as though both the major parties, one of which is likely to win the presidency and Congress and so on, is going to continue the policy of attempted domination, which does not seem likely to succeed. And what the West really needs are political forces that are capable of saying, look, folks, we've tried domination and we succeeded at domination for a while, but now it's no longer working. And we need to settle down to essentially recognizing that we will be just one part, sort of a co-equal part of a world which is changing very rapidly, in which other countries are acquiring more power, economic, political, and other forms of power, cultural power. And this we have to think about having cooperative relationships for mutual benefit with other countries rather than relationships of domination, relationships of superiority. And I think it's going to be a while before these forces emerge. There are rumblings of that. There are forces emerging, but they are still relatively nascent. But Oleg, maybe you should go next.
Yeah, that's true. I agree with you, and I remember somebody now said at our conference that we wish that the United States would become a normal superpower. So without ambitions to be hegemonic, to be leader or the leader of the world, the only leader of the world. But like one of many poles of the world or many focus points of the world, something, whatever you name it. And interestingly, also what is importance of the Valdai is to check the views, the approaches from various non-Western countries. Because the position of Russia, mainly the official position of Russia, is quite radical, understandably now, and strongly anti-Western. Almost all other countries are not following that position. The Chinese are in the middle because, sure, the Chinese don't want to break all the links, to cut all the links with the West, with the Western financial system and so on. But they start to understand that China will be the next target, whatever they do, whatever they say. And so they prepare how to confront it, how to defend itself in such a situation. Other countries, sure, they have a long list of problems with the United States, with the West, connected to neocolonialism, connected to protectionism, and so on. But they are still part of the world where the West is an organic part, I would say. And that is also important. And I think what is useful for Russian experts now and Russian decision makers, because we experts understand it, to Russian decision makers to see the difference of views of non-Western among the non-Western countries. That okay, Russia is we are trying to oppose ourselves as a kind of a pioneer with a torch, with the fire, showing the way to the new world. Maybe so, maybe no. But to understand the position of more moderate countries, some of them are much more moderate. And what Richard rightly said, there was a quite interesting session on Ukrainian conflict with diverse views. And we see the growing, let's say, lobbying in the positive sense of the world of both China and India and Brazil and African countries just for ceasefire, immediate ceasefire. But it's the problem for the West, and I think it could be a problem for us as well, because nobody wants to lose the face. Because that war, as many other wars, became a zero-sum game. And a draw, a kind of a draw, a ceasefire, Korean scenario, whatever, is not welcomed by both parts. That's also an issue that we could understand and maybe to resolve it somehow.
Diesen, maybe you might want to comment on whether you think that this American election will make any result to the outcome of the Ukrainian war.
Well, most likely will. If I could just first one brief comment based on what was said before. I think, whenever we talk about the hegemonic order, usually people think about, for example, Brzezinski, who wrote effectively the Bible on unipolarity after the Cold War. So keep your adversaries divided, apart, keep your allies dependent. They did this kind of logic, but often it's very well known for this. What is not that well known for is, he also wrote back in 2012 or 13, he wrote a book, I think it was called The Choice or something, where he's pointing out that, unipolarity is coming to an end, what he had argued for. So the United States, he would have an option between either accommodating, trying to facilitate the main institutions and framework for a multipolar world, and thus be, I think he framed it as the first among equals, so have a privileged position in a multipolar system, but still be another normal state. Alternatively, it could try to resist this, that is, to hold on to unipolarity as long as it could, prevent the rise of alternatives, but then nonetheless, a multipolar system will still emerge, but then it would more likely be in opposition to the United States. So I think it's that is why I think it was important what all of you mentioned. There's a difference between being anti-American and anti-hegemonic. So And so this has a lot of opportunities, I think, for a country like United States, who are exhausted politically, economically, socially, that this is a multipolarity is indeed is a way to pull a bit back, lick its wounds, and there's the whole purpose of a multipolar system that it naturally balances itself. Let's say tomorrow China will start to impose a lot of try to impose itself on Russia to dictate its policies. Something the Russians could become connect themselves closer with India, for example. So it would be mechanisms in the system to punish belligerent behavior, which is why you see countries like China is not suggesting any to replace an American hegemony. It doesn't have the capabilities and doesn't have the intention. So there's a lot of opportunities, and often I think about Adam Smith. He wrote that with the discoveries of the East Indies and Americas, he called it the two best discoveries in humanity. But he also noted that because the huge asymmetries in economic power, it manifested itself very destructively. So exploitation, whoever the Europeans met, we effectively destroyed. So he argued that the world might be more peaceful and better if once the distribution of power is more evenly distributed. So we're effectively living in this time. We see now, for the first time since, well, I would say industrial revolution, that power has become much more evenly divided. So I think there's an opportunity for something positive. There's a lot of good opportunities. Again, for Europeans, the idea of connecting, integrating with more with Asia, and of course overcoming this post-Cold War failure to find a mutually acceptable post-Cold War settlement, avoid this militarization and redivision of Europe. There's a lot of opportunities, and it's often obscured by very hostile Cold War language where we somehow believe we're fighting the Soviet Union again. So, but anyways, sorry for that little detour. Your question was on the American election, and I kind of assumed that it was most likely Trump would win. I think simply because Kamala is the incumbent, and it's very hard at the moment. She tries to distance herself from the failing war in Ukraine or the genocide in Palestine, or the failure of controlling the border. So I think, of course, I could be wrong, but Trump doesn't differ significantly on any foreign policy, I would say, besides for Ukraine. But at least I guess he has the benefit of having the optimism of change attached to him at the moment when the majority of people feel the country is going in the wrong direction. Now, I think his main difference on Ukraine will be, as he said, he would like to pull out of this. I think everyone's recognizing that NATO and Ukraine lost the war, so it's better to pull away from this. I think he surrounded himself with a lot of people who committed themselves to this, not just Vance, but you have Kennedy and Tulsi Gabbard. So a lot of the people around him want this they have following this anti-war, get out of this endless war. And also Trump, I think he has this, for following the advice that, you shouldn't carry through with Kissinger's worst nightmare. So trying to defeat the Russians and the Chinese at the same time, he pushed them together. He thinks he can pull them apart. Again, very still committed to hegemony, but nonetheless, that's not going to happen anymore. But what one could do is at least stop to threaten both countries. And so he's even indicated that, at least in one interview he did with David Sachs, that he might even be willing to take NATO expansionism off the table as in a settlement. And this is really the core. This is why we have a war and the NATO expansion. So being able to address the actual source of it, I think, is important. So for all his faults, I would be more optimistic there on a Trump presidency in terms of pursuing a peaceful solution to what is effectively already a lost war. Kamala, I think to some extent, Kamala Harris, I forget, she's, I think would be a bit of a continuation from Biden, but I might be wrong, because Biden has been very much wedded to this war for the past decade, and very belligerent since not just 2014, where got his family involved as well, but also the escalation in 2021. So I think as it might be an opportunity for Kamala Harris to take a bit different path and not wed herself to a war which is already failing. It could be an opportunity to chart a bit of a different path. But again, it's hard to tell these days because they say what the public wants to hear before the election. So I guess we'll see.
Yeah, sure. Richard, did you want to go next?
Just on the election, I mean, I agree with what's just been said, but Kamala Harris has got a rather different, or she's building a different foreign policy team around her, Phil Gordon and a few others, and also who won't be whoever wins this election won't be about in the future. And we're talking about its Secretary of State Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who really have been, along with Biden, the architects of this war, and indeed the architects of the catastrophic failures to halt the genocide in Gaza. So whoever wins, foreign policy will change quite significantly. Yes, Kamala Harris is the continuity candidate, but even during this election, she's tried to distance herself from what came before. So there's going to be something new. Just to say that the context is also important to change. One thing we've been discussing a lot is the emergence of the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa plus format, 4 new members. And what's been quite significant is that those members, not all represented here, but Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran has been very strongly, and the United Arab Emirates, plus the establishment of 13 partner states, including Turkey, a NATO member, as well as Malaysia. So, this is a tangible manifestation of the way that we are moving into a post-Western world, but with the new institutions emerging. But I wanted to, one of the debates which has been going on is whether this new, you mentioned a new world order, but I wouldn't use that term. I'd say a new potential, whether this new framework will remain within the framework of the Charter International System, the UN system established in 1945. And one of the big debates we've been having, both in Valdai and many other places, is whether it will reinforce and make the system work better, this charter system, or whether we need to start building institutions outside of it. And also applies to the session you were on earlier today about the financial system and whether, and one of the very powerful speakers from Brazil argued that the Bretton Woods institutions are unreformable. But that's rather different because that's a subset of the thing. The United Nations itself, we can criticize it endlessly, and we do because it's not working as it should. But so that really is one of the fundamental issues facing us today. Personally, I don't see an alternative in a normative sense. There's lots of practical issues we can deal with of the UN Charter. It's about the best we could do in the present stage of the development of humanity. But to make it work better, we want to see BRICS and others. There's also the ASEAN, the 10 members in ASEAN in Asia. They have, and I've been saying it for years, they've had the ASEAN way, which is about dialogue, which is about pluralism. It's about different types of systems living and working together. And of course, what is most dangerous now is the way that the United States is trying to NATO-ize the security there. It's managed to NATO-ize the European Union quite marvelously to the detriment of the European peace and security order. So that's, I think, one of the key issues facing us. And of course, it'll be fascinating to see after this election how the new US president is going to deal with that issue, because we know that Trump isn't a fan of the United Nations or any multilateral format.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, I just, there's so many things that, so many interesting things you guys have said. I want to pick up on several things. So first, let me just say about the election. I mean, I think that it seems as though at one level, no matter who wins, at one level, you may say not much will change. But on another level, if you may want to see the glass is half full or half empty, one of the things that is definitely driving this election is a relatively widespread feeling that the United States is devoting vast quantities of resources, money, etc., going to Ukraine, going to Israel, etc., keeping these wars going that, at least in my view, are unwinnable for the United States. But at this, and while people in the United States are feeling the economic pinch. Various natural disasters have occurred in the recent past where people have felt that the government has not stepped up to help them to the same extent while they are sending billions of dollars abroad for wars that cannot be won, etc. So to that extent, I do think that if Trump is elected, it will be very much in large part because, on the strength of such feeling that really the United States should really be focusing on affairs at home rather than involving itself in wars abroad. But even if Harris is elected, I mean, I feel that there will be a sense in which, for example, it's quite possible that the Biden administration has been essentially keeping the war going because to stop it before the election would amount to admitting defeat. And it could not afford to do that. But once the election is over, no matter who is in the White House, they could say, okay, they don't have to admit defeat, but they can say, well, we are now diverting our attention elsewhere. We are going to focus at home. We're going to focus on China, whatever thing they may say something sensible. They may continue to say something only slightly less mad, but nevertheless, I think that we may see a change coming. And really, I also wanted to add another thing. One of you mentioned the United States as an ordinary country. I remember in the 1970s, a political scientist called Rosenkranz, I think John Rosenkranz, wrote a book called America as an Ordinary Country. We tend to forget how much the 1970s in many ways resembled today's moment. In the 1970s, the United States was in deep economic crisis. The Third World was asserting itself in a number of ways. So were European countries, and so on. So in many ways, and remember Carter gave this famous Malaise speech, which then Reagan turned against him and managed to win the 1980 election. But, in that speech, Carter actually said that the United States should settle down to being essentially a more ordinary country, to focusing on affairs at home rather than trying to run the world and so on. And then somehow the neoliberals and eventually the neoconservatives got the bit between their teeth and sort of, took America on this path of an attempted domination, which we now realize 30 years later, and, for a while after the demise of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall, it looked as though the United States was going to enjoy its multipolar moment. But that was never to be. Within a decade, Jim O'Neill had written his BRICS article. By 2008, people were already talking about multipolarity. And over the past 15 years, we've seen the more and more talk of multipolarity, and of course, the rise of China. So in a certain sense, it's as though there was this kind of brief sort of a kind of a supernova phase of US hegemony, which is now coming to an end. So that's another thing I just wanted to throw into the mix, that in a certain sense, I've long argued that the US was never hegemonic. It emerged as the most powerful country at the end of the Second World War, in part because the Second World War had vastly expanded its economy while it had destroyed the economy of other powers. So that, of course, the United States was going to become very preeminent, but that preeminence declined very quickly. And we were already in the 1970s at roughly the spot we are at now. And then you had this madcap neoconservative, neoliberal drive to dominate the world. So that's one set of points I wanted to make. On the UN Charter, I also like to say, people here have been discussing all sorts of ideas, and that's part of the excitement of being at Valdai, is that you hear, but all sorts of people are thinking, can the BRICS replace the UN and all that? And I think that's really kind of not only pie in the sky, but it is really surplus to requirements. I agree with you, Richard, that the United Nations Charter actually represents some extremely valuable principles. And the reason it represents extremely valuable principles is that, the moment of 1945 is always remembered as though it were the moment of US domination. But actually, even then, even when the United States accounted for half the world's GNP and had 70% of the world's gold reserves and whatnot, these statistics are bandied about very commonly. But even then, the United States could not have its way. It had to accept a United Nations based on the principles of equal sovereignty, non-aggression, and all these sorts of things, one nation, one vote, and so on. And even though it compromised these principles, for example, by creating a permanent P5 in the UN Security Council, the P5 had to include the Soviet Union. And eventually, of course, China, for a long time, the United States tried to reserve the seat of, give the seat of China to Taiwan. Madly, you think, how crazy is that? But that's how crazy things were. But nevertheless, the Soviet Union had to be included in it. And as I say, eventually China. And yes, in the last many decades, the United States, and it had a preponderant power in IMF and the World Bank. So yeah, they are probably unreformable. But the core principles of the UN Charter were actually the result of the US needing to keep the Western Europeans and Japan on side, needing to acknowledge the Soviet Union at least, and having to acknowledge the moment of decolonization and the admission of all these new countries into the United Nations. So all of these elements, and that's why the United Nations Charter actually is as progressive as it is, because it was not a product of American domination, but a product of a tiff between American domination and a new world that was emerging. And so it produced a compromise. And in that compromise, the UN Charter principles themselves are kind of still worth hanging on to. They are actually very close to all the principles that BRICS countries continue to reiterate, cooperation for mutual benefit, respect for sovereignty, non-aggression, etc. So they will last, I think. They will remain. And what we'll have to do is we'll have to obviously, maybe the IMF and the World Bank may not survive, but over time, I think somebody called it today the privatization of UN institutions. Essentially, the insertion of American corporate power into the UN system will have to be removed. It will have to go back to a kind of a cooperative interstate relationship, and I think that will be a good thing. But the principles of the UN Charter will definitely survive. And if I don't say this now, I'll forget it. So I just will insert one more point, and then I'll hand over to the rest of you. But the one point you made earlier, Richard, as well, is really quite important. You talked about macro historical thinking, which is now required, because we are at this moment when history is changing in such a profound way that it is forcing us to step back and look at a much larger span of history than the last 200 odd years during which the West has been so dominant. We are being forced to, various countries, China, India, Russia, are looking back at their longer term history. Russia is kind of looking at itself and saying, we are closing a chapter that began with Peter the Great, opening Russia up to the West. Now we are no longer, in fact, Oleg, you said that Russia is maybe a little anti-Western, but I would say no. The West has become very anti-Russian. Russia has reacted to that by saying, okay, if you don't want to play with us, we'll find other friends to play with. And they are now engaging with China and so on. So the macro historical part is that all of us are, if we step back and we realize that, say, 300, 400, 500 years ago, it was Asia that was a center of, world manufacturing, world technology development, etc., the center of the world economy, and so on. This will be so again. And it makes sense. Asia is the most densely populated part of the world. Why should it not be the economically biggest part of the world? And so on. So all of these this macro historical thinking is actually, the fact that we are forced to engage in it is actually a sign of how profound the changes are that we are undergoing. And so that's the point I wanted to make. But I'll end here for now.
Well, if I could just say something on the United Nations. There's a nice quote, or to paraphrase Dag Hammarskjöld, is the second UN Secretary General. He made the argument that the UN wasn't supposed to take us to heaven, but prevent us from going to hell. In other words, it's not supposed to solve all our problem, but it's as good as it gets. This is, if you can prevent the wars between the great powers, this is, show me a better system. I think this is the attitude we should take to, if people suggest to discard or reform the United Nations. That is, what would be an alternative first? Because often it's one throws out the baby with the bathwater, as the saying goes. But I think a key challenge to the UN system, though, because the United Nations set up in 1945, when they had a balance of power, international law reflecting the power distribution is based on mutual constraint, and this is what we accept. Both sides restrict what they can do in foreign policy, and in return you get predictability and reciprocity. So, but in a unipolar moment, why would anyone put restraints on themselves? The United States. So under this, I think we began to dismantle a lot of the key principles, primarily sovereign equality, and I think that's why the UN is also struggling now. That's why we have different rules for different countries, and I think this is the main issues which has to be addressed, and I agree that reforms are needed, but again, I think maybe we take a very realist view, but I think institutions are effective and strong to the extent they do reflect this distribution of power, which is why I think it's important to have some reforms. For example, if China grows up to be, it is becoming very powerful, why would it want to commit itself to a UN system where France has more say? So I think it's not to point out to the Indians, but I think there has to be some reforms to take into account that the world does not look like it does in 1945. So I think having veto power, for example, to a permanent seat at the UN Security Council to India, possibly Brazil, I think this would be possibly quite a positive development. Otherwise, this Russia shift to the east, it has to be said, this is something they thought about for a long time, because in the past, modernization and development meant always for Russia to look to Europe, which is why Peter the Great, after defeating the Swedes, he went to modernizing Russia, meant to Europeanize Russia. But if you look through the 19th century, if you read Dostoevsky's idea that the Europeans never wanted us, they look at the way they treated us, and we should look to the East instead. Even and transforming this into economic policy, you see Sergei Witte towards the end of the 19th century looking towards how they can reorient their economy to diversify, to not be excessively dependent. But again, today, all of this, I would say, would be almost on steroids, because modernizing now doesn't mean to Europeanize anymore. If anything, Russia looks east. It sees partners which are less hostile. Their economies are much more stable and growing faster, and it's also doesn't have the same historical baggage and tension. So when Russia goes to the east, it has that doesn't mean they meet that many aggressive adversaries. Furthermore, I think initially the concern about China being a lot larger in terms of economics, I think it can also work in Russia's advantage now. And you kind of see this, because when countries see China being very big, they kind of have the same interests as Russia. They don't want Russia to become excessively dependent only on one other actor, because this asymmetrical economic interdependence can lead to China asserting maybe unwarranted political influence. So if you're India, if you're Japan, if you're Iran, if you're the countries and regions, what do you want to do? You don't want to do a hard balance against China. Of course, it's an important Eurasian partner, but you do want to allow Russia to diversify. So now you're seeing other countries reaching out to Russia with the shared interest of having a balance of power in the Eurasian space. So I think it is good to look at the past, what's happened over the past few hundred years, but it's also worth noticing that there's something very different in the world today as opposed to how it's been in the past.
Oleg, Richard, yeah, go ahead.
If I may, just a couple of words about the new institutions. And sure, and we also seen it at our conference now that there were some proposals for a set of new institutions for the non-Western world, or for the world majority, or for the global South, focusing on non-Western approaches to climate change, to food security, to health, and so on. But if you see the practice, we would see how slow is the BRICS to be institutionalized properly. Because it's just an annual summit. It's a kind of club. I would name it the BRICS Club, like the Valdai Club. Sure, there is the New Development Bank established and so on. But we see it in discussions with BRICS that the countries don't want to establish absolutely alternative institutions. Maybe some of them are connected with the West, with the Western institutions. So everybody criticized the UN ineffectiveness, rightly, absolutely. Everybody criticized the IMF and so on. But to build something specific, there is not so much desire. And there is another point, how cautious, for example, the Chinese to the idea to promote the renminbi as the new global reserve currency instead of the US dollar. If we are talking about the de-dollarizations, one of the scenarios is just to replace the dollar with the renminbi. And the Chinese don't want to do it. I'm afraid of it, frankly speaking. It was my personal feeling in some conferences in China. They're afraid of it. So maybe they think that it's better to be a contender than a champion. Maybe it's a consequence of their anti-hegemonic position. They don't want to be the new hegemon instead of the United States. But we see Russia officially opposed a set of new ideas for the BRICS financial system, the payment system, and so on. But it was quite warmly welcome at the last BRICS summit, but saying that, okay, it's only for those countries who want it, who desire it. It's not obligatory for all other countries. So we see the cautious approaches of many in the Southern countries to build a new alternative. And it was a real surprise, a total surprise for me when Vladimir Putin said at the end of the Kazan summit, of the BRICS summit, that the BRICS is not the alternative. Because the whole logic, the whole maybe symbolic logic of the BRICS existence was that it is alternative. It is the alternative, or one of the alternatives to the West, maybe just in values, just in symbols, but still. And Putin said, maybe expressing the intention of all other leaders of the BRICS, he said that it's not the alternative, it's just, I don't know, want an addition or something. So nobody dares to make a revolution.
Yeah, that's exactly in line with what he argued last year at Valdai. I asked him the question about the United Nations and the international system, And he very much affirmed that that international system, sometimes in Russia it's known as the Yalta-Potsdam system, but that's only a subset of what was much larger. And indeed, from this perspective of BRICS being, if you like, part of the suborders. You have the political West, and I'm now arguing we have the emergence of a political East, and BRICS is part of that. And absolutely right. The global South is not like some in the West or in the United States call them swing states. People very much object to that term, but Oleg is absolutely right that in other words, there's a sort of an evolutionary process going on. And this is not, I've always argued that Russia is not a revisionist state, because a revisionist state like Nazi Germany wants to smash the whole system, or Bolshevik Russia. But there is no way in which Russia, China, India, any of the BRICS countries want to do that. What they want to do is to defend this international system. So they're very much status quo conservative powers. But what they do want to change is the character of international politics. This idea of bloc politics, the obsession with military dominance of the political West. They're building closer ties with Australia through AUKUS, the Quad, all of that sort of stuff. Is the rest of the world looks upon that with revulsion, because what they're saying is the joint statements and all the Chinese documents saying, no, let that in the Charter international system dominate. We don't want to smash it. We benefit. China, as Oleg absolutely rightly said, it's a beneficiary of the international system. Why on earth would they want to do it? But what they do reject is the arguments like people like Eichenberry, is to make this, what he said, the liberal international order should be so flexible that China join it. The Chinese said, why on earth should we don't want to join anything? We are part of a founder member of that United Nations, as was mentioned earlier. China was a signatory of the UN Declaration of January 1942. And in other words, in an ideal world, which hopefully is going to happen, we can just see a gradual evolution to the fulfillment of the idealism which established the UN in the first place in 1945, after the worst war that humanity has ever had. So we're still a long way from achieving even the potential of that system, let alone thinking of something about what comes next, as Glenn put it just now.
Yeah, and one of the things that one hears repeatedly at this conference, as well as previous Valdai conferences, is an aversion to bloc politics. Exactly. What people want is a system that's sufficiently open as to allow countries to make whatever bilateral and multilateral relations and groupings that they want to make as they see, as suits their needs. And I think that's definitely it. And it seems that, what basically is emerging is that there is one part of the world that is still engaged in bloc politics, which is the West, basically, the political West, and everybody else is rejecting it. And I think that the way in which the world majority is proceeding is that they're basically saying to the West, look, as soon as you're ready to be part of this cooperative, multipolar world, you're very welcome. Nobody's being anti-Western, but you're just going to have to understand that that's what you are joining. You're not joining something so that you can dominate it. You are going to join a system in which no country dominates. And I just wanted to come back very briefly to this point about de-dollarization. Oleg, you were saying that, China is afraid of making the renminbi the world's currency, but actually the dollar system has never been viable, and it has not even served the Americans very well. Just as the sterling system was, when it was at its peak, was precisely that period coincided with the beginning of British deindustrialization. Similarly, the peak of the dollar system has coincided with American deindustrialization. And I think that the Germans, for example, or the Chinese or Japanese and others have always known that internationalizing their currency, their national currency, in ways that the dollar has been internationalized, was to invite deindustrialization and financialization, and therefore they have not done it. And that's why the de-dollarization will have to happen, because the dollar system is not viable, but it cannot take the form of another national currency playing the role of a world currency. It must take the form of other arrangements. Keynes proposed a very different arrangement in which there would be a multilaterally created currency that would be the national currency of no country. It would be a currency used by central banks to settle their imbalances. Bancor would not be used by you and me to buy a bar of chocolate or a pair of shoes. No, it was to be used among central banks, and that's a very different system. It is a system designed to allow countries to run their economies for productive growth. Whereas the dollar system has required the financialization of the US and the de-industry. So that's a whole complex question, but it does return us to the question of multipolarity. The reason why we have multipolarity is countries like China have not adopted that system, and they have focused on developing their productive economy, and that is as it should be. And clearly Russia is doing that now, and that's a great thing. And there's just one other thing which one should throw into the mix. The United States' victory in the Cold War was in many ways a Pyrrhic victory, because it coincided with the moment when the United States, having adopted neoliberalism and financialization, was already set on the path towards the economic decline that it has experienced. That is why within less than a decade, people were no longer talking about about unipolarity, but about BRICS. And within less than 2 decades, people were talking about multipolarity. So neoliberalism is very much part of the disease of the West, and that is also part of the history of capitalism, because neoliberalism is the only form capitalism can take today. So I just wanted to throw that in. You may not agree, but that's very much part of the story. And that's why various forms of planned economy, you can call them what, it may take more or less capitalist forms, more or less socialist forms, but some or the other kind of planned economy, as the Chinese have, will be the way to go. It will increasingly be seen as the way to go. And one of the key things that the world majority is fighting for is economic sovereignty. Why is economic sovereignty so important? Because part of the West's domination has been to impose on the rest of the world neoliberal openness, which is a recipe for underdevelopment. And most of the countries of the world are beginning to recognize that, and they want to be able to have their own versions of their own national economy, which is why this economic sovereignty is so important.
I suspect when people say, the election make America great again, I keep thinking they're very specific. They're thinking about 1973, because this was really peak, and then after this, of course, began to go bad. And as you said, in the 80s, they have this push towards an extremely flexible economy under the Reagan Thatcherite. What you say reminds me what Thomas Piketty writes, because throughout the 80s, then both the US and UK exhaust themselves, and you really want to have a correct then when you get into the 90s, but instead you have the collapse of the Soviet Union, and just hubris kicks in big time, and suddenly just the unrestrained market becomes the silver bullet to fix everything. And now, yeah, of course, the party is coming to an end, and the consequences have built up. Just as a last point, I also agree. I think instead of replacing one nation's currency with another, I think something along the SDRs or a basket of currencies is required. Otherwise, if you want to see why countries are attracted to this multipolar system, BRICS, for example, why is Turkey, a NATO member, looking towards it? Because often we tend to always look things through the prism of our own, coming from the West, bloc politics. So are you going to belong to our bloc, or are you going to switch over to Russian bloc or a Chinese bloc? The whole point for the reason why countries like Turkey is attracted to BRICS is exactly because it's not a bloc in this sense. It's not an alliance which cuts itself off from others. And indeed, when did ever BRICS tell the Turks, "Oh, you can't do economic cooperation with the Americans or the Germans. It's this exact point. In a multipolar world, you want to diversify your economic connectivity. You want to connect with all the major poles in the system because this enables you, this diversification, this multi-vector foreign policy. It enables you to have more political independence. You can have more political autonomy, run your own foreign policy. This is very different than being subordinated in a bloc to a dominant state. So I think this is what countries are after. Once I think if BRICS would turn into a bloc where it prohibits members from cooperating economically with the United States or the EU, a lot of countries would turn away, as we heard here in Valdai as well. But no one is suggesting this. This is the whole point. It's not one bloc or the other. It's trying to create a vastly different system, one we never had before. So sorry, I'll leave that as my last comment.
And on that point, what Oleg said about BRICS has not effectively institutionalized itself. You could argue that's a negative. It's a club, as you say, but at the same time, perhaps that's its genius. That it, as Glenn's just said, it's actually precisely. It's open. It's flexible. I mean, perhaps it maybe a permanent secretariat just to organize things may be useful, but that's about as far as one would go at this stage. And move more to work more like ASEAN does, which is very loose. As a loose family, maybe not a club, but let's call it a family or community of like-minded. And just on that point, by the way, it's interesting that this latest BRICS summit in Kazan met at the same time when the Commonwealth, the former British Commonwealth, was meeting in Samoa. And it was interesting that leading Commonwealth leaders, like the leader of South Africa and, of course, India, preferred to go to Kazan than to Samoa. I mean, Samoa is a marvelous place, no doubt, but it was clearly they felt it more important to be part of that club, part of that family, rather than the old colonial family. I mean, hopefully they will go to Commonwealth meetings, because I also think that as a framework simply for countries to come together to talk about development and common issues is important. So one shouldn't be set against the other. But in this case, the meetings clashed. So it was quite important symbolically.
Yeah, I think we've been going for nearly an hour. So maybe it's time for any closing statements. Maybe in whatever order, I don't mind. Just jump in, please.
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts just to react. I agree with Richard, and exactly one of the topics in our annual report that you, Radhika, presented at the beginning was to reflect how to transform this, let's say, a weakness of the fact that the BRICS has no bloc discipline, is not institutionalized, into how to transform it from a kind of weakness into a kind of strength. It was exactly what Glenn was saying about being more flexible, being more adaptive, being open to other initiatives, other countries, and so on. So it's also we try to do it in our report. And yeah.
Anyone else?
Well, just to say that I'd go back to a point I made earlier, but I think it's so important that we don't want revolution, as it were, but we do want fundamental evolution, and perhaps sometimes evolution today is the new revolution, if you see what I mean, because it's perhaps more transformative if we continue this multipolarity, BRICS, this post-Western world, which would actually improve, as you suggested, the West itself. This post-Western world, post-colonial world, post-whatever, and then we can stop, by the way, using this word post so much, and we could then enter a post-postist world, which will be quite more positive.
Yeah, I think, sorry, just very briefly, I think it's important because over the past 30 years, if you ever criticized any of the parts of the American empire, they would say you are anti-American. And if there's anything in the West we're obsessed about, it's narratives. But I think the narrative is changing a bit because this is why even in the US they're talking about stopping the forever war because the country is exhausted. There's no other word for it, and I think it's more coming down to a choice between empire or republic because the more you hear more and more, even in the United States, people who express the idea that if they continue down this path, they will have immense problems. So why aren't we spending more money at home? Why aren't we building up our own infrastructure? Why send all this money abroad to fight wars in Ukraine or Middle East? It's so the whole the idea that this is a pro-American idea to spend all your resources, run yourself into debt, and make an enemy of the entire world. It's that argument is becoming less attractive, I think. So so while they have a tendency to speak everything being pro or against this or that, hopefully I think narrative changes a bit and there will be more nuance in terms of seeing everything as a threat. And if you're looking for an out after clearly imperial overstretch, I think there's some reasons for optimism out there in all the darkness these days.
Yes, and I think, I think ordinary people in most Western countries, at least more and more ordinary people, are beginning to realize that. And I think therein lies the hope, both for those countries, the Western countries, and I would say for the rest of the world, because obviously if the West continues to remain warlike, it's not going to look very pretty. I just thought I would end by pointing out one thing which kind of goes back to the macro historical theme that we were talking about, all of us, the big changes that are taking place. And I just thought I would show this map that I found very interesting. It's in the report that the Valdai Club published, which is part of the report that we were talking about. And this map is really about all the land communication links that will be made across the world by the Russians, by the Chinese as part of the BRI. And this really makes me reflect that really when we are talking about a post-Western world, we are talking about the world that will succeed the world that was created by Western imperialism. And for historical reasons, Western imperialism was very much a maritime enterprise. It was based on sea power. And it seems as though a more peaceful world, the more peaceful world that we're all looking forward to, we are all hoping that will be born, and that is being born as we speak, whose progress, in a certain sense, we are sort of measuring at every Valdai meeting, is this kind of world which will interconnect people to each other for their mutual benefit, rather than connecting people in far-flung places to imperial metropolises where all their products and their surpluses go, and so on. And I think that this whole possibility of these land connections it promises to transform the world in very important ways, and maybe that will be another way in which the macro historically the world will change. So yeah, I guess we should probably wind down now. So thank you so much, and I really feel that we've managed to convey some of the intellectual excitement and political excitement that one feels, the hope that one experiences at these Valdai meetings. So, and other such places, I'm sure, because this world that is being born is not just being born at Valdai. There are many other conferences and organizations, BRICS meetings, and so on, where these discussions are taking place. And I hope that we conveyed some of the flavor to our audience. So thank you very much, and see you next time.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.